Welcome to In Reality, the podcast about truth, disinformation, and the media. I'm Eric Schurenberg, longtime journalist and media executive, now the founder of the Alliance for Trust in Media. So, what happened to truth in the digital age, and how will AI challenge it even further? Those are the questions at the heart of today's conversation. My guest is Steve Rosenbaum, Emmy award-winning filmmaker, founder of the Sustainable Media Center, and the author of the new book, The Future of Truth. The book runs through just about every institution that was once a pillar of what Jonathan Rauch calls the reality-based community. That is, media, law, science, economics, medicine, and how AI is already reshaping it. We'll talk about why those institutions lost their authority and what fills the vacuum. We'll talk about a generation raised inside the social media feed on whom we've been conducting a society-level experiment whose outcome we can't predict. And we'll talk about whether there is any path back to truth as we once knew it through regulation or technology or just old-fashioned media literacy. And now here's Steve Rosenbaum. Steve Rosenbaum, welcome to In Reality.
I'm enjoying being in reality with you.
That is great. Just by way of introduction, you're the executive director of the Sustainable Media Center. Tell us what the center does.
So the Sustainable Media Center was founded 3 years ago as young people started to tell some of their senior partners and friends that social media was essentially tearing apart their society and childhood. And it is an intergenerational organization, which is incredibly exciting. And so I have a board of directors that is experienced media people and then lots of 22-year-olds who are amazing. And collectively, we're starting to see the beginnings of real change around how social media is going to be allowed to impact young people.
Yeah, we will talk about that later. And full disclosure, I'm one of those ancient media dinosaurs who was on your leadership council.
We call them X+1.
Any euphemism in a storm will do.
Yes.
But let's talk about your book. Your book is audaciously, let me put it that way, called The Future of Truth, which is a very interesting proposition. You have a master's in truth, a self-designed course from NYU. So it begs the question of starting with, what is truth? If you will, let me kind of road test it with my ideas. So we've had
Sure, please.
Jonathan Rauch of Brookings on the podcast and fact checkers from Pointer and the Washington Post. So I would argue that objective truth is not really that slippery a concept. It can be distorted, but the truth itself isn't that hard to identify. So 3 characteristics. Truth is a claim that describes the world whether you believe it or not. So it's independent of belief. If you head in one direction and you follow the equator, you're going to end up where you started 24,900 miles later, even if you are a flat earther. Second characteristic. A true claim is one that could, in theory, be disproven, but so far has resisted all attempts to disprove it. The epistemologist Karl Popper calls that falsifiability. And third aspect of truth is that it doesn't depend on who makes a true claim. The Pope has no more authority to decide what's a fact than the president or a grad student or anyone else. What matters is whether it adheres to those first 2 characteristics. Okay? So that's my simple understanding of factuality. What's wrong with that?
So many things. Where do we begin? How do I say this in a way without taking a sharp pencil to my friend Eric? Our lives, I'll put you and I in the same category. The work we've done in our careers relies on those things to be operational. The magazines you've published, the other books I've written, the films I've made, all require us as a society, as a community, to have kind of a collective understanding that 1 + 1 = 2. That the earth is in fact not flat. And, I have this conversation, part of what makes me an interesting person in this conversation is that I spend a lot of time with young people and a lot of time with experienced media people, and they feel really differently about it. And many of them say versions of what you do to me, which is like, Steve, I had dinner with a world-class economist yesterday, and he said, Steve, there's always this crisis of confidence in The television was going to do it and radio was going to do it and books and printing presses. And we're just in another one of those moments where technology is going to come in and upset our understanding of where information comes from. But calm down, everything's okay, he said. And I have to say, when I started out when I started with the master's degree, I probably was in that camp.
Uh-huh.
And in the middle of the study, two things happened: COVID and AI, which my science tech friends tell me was happening for a very long time, but it burst onto the scene with ChatGPT and became, and so what I try to argue in the book gently to my wise friends is that the difference here is fundamental. And I'll just give you an example. As we record this, just a couple of days ago, the Washington Press Club got together and there was a shooting, and every reporter in the known universe was in the same room, most of them having had a couple of drinks. And all of a sudden, they were all on duty and they were all tweeting and chatting and posting. Sitting here 3 days later, I can't tell you with any certainty what happened. Just what happened. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there were gunshots. Was anyone shot? How did the shooter end up on the ground with his shirt off? Did he have a shotgun or an automatic weapon? And there's so much information out there, including this massive drumbeat of people saying it was staged. He was,
Right.
whatever. It was another. But as a news consumer, if I take my news maker hat off and I put my news consumer hat on, my reaction, and I say this at the risk of some of my friends who are going to watch this being angry with me, is I'm like, you know what? I don't even know if I am so overwhelmed by inputs, some of them true and some of them false, that I don't know what happened. And more and more as a consumer of information, I feel that way.
Hmm. Okay.
Uh, and for young people who get their news in a very different way than you and I used to get ours, or still do, they consume their information. We can debate later in the pod whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing. But a whole lot of their news and information comes from TikTok, for which the blurring of fact and fiction is kind of their raison d'etre. So,
Oh, okay.
so, so, so it's not that your thesis doesn't hold up intellectually. It's that for average people, the volume of things that have no obligation to be factual is growing every day.
Okay. All right. I could concede that there are many reasons that that kind of kernel of factuality can get distorted. You mentioned one in your understanding of the assassination attempt at the White House Correspondents' Dinner was just kind of overload of information. And there are other things that might drive people to distort truth, like the profit motive or desire for power or for followers or for, establishing yourself as part of an in group. All of that is as old as human speech.
Or even something more cynical than that, which is, you know, I wasn't planning on getting to this in the first 5 minutes of our conversation, but the destruction of democracy. That essentially democracy requires you and I, even if we disagree politically, to have some set of shared facts,
Yes.
like about where the sun rises and sets. And at
Yeah.
the point at which average people who are trying to feed their families and go to work and pay for their health care just find themselves drowning in noise, they just throw up their hand and say, you know what? They're all liars. They're all liars. And I worry that we're teetering there.
There is certainly a, a cynical motivation for people to foster that idea that you can't believe anything. I guess it summons up the old Stalinist point of view is that everything is possible and nothing is true, the way people consumed information in the old Soviet Union.
I was going to get to Orwell about now, but Stalin, Orwell.
Really?
Yeah.
But let's pivot to AI, which is, as you mentioned, is kind of the new player on the scene. Does AI create a new kind of distortion or gravitational pull against truth, or does it just scale incentives to falsehood that were always there?
So in the book, there's a chapter in which I spend a bunch of time with my friend Esther Dyson. And part of what I'm proud of in the book is I am not the truth expert. Please do not misunderstand me for the oracle of truth. I am not that character. I am, however, a really good reporter, having spent most of my career being a reporter. And it turns out, as I was writing this, that just by being on the planet for a long time and in the tech space, I know a lot of extraordinarily smart people, much smarter than I am. And the interviews in the book, I hope you found kind of curiously fun in that they're not formal. And Esther's conversation is wide ranging, but really what she comes down to is it's about incentives. And what she says is, the companies that are now manufacturing truth or trying to be the new tellers of truth, which is essentially the big LLMs at this moment,
Mhm.
have raised enormous amounts of money, which they owe to their funders. Nobody who wrote checks to those companies is going, well, if I don't get it back, it's no big deal. They're basically saying, hey, let's move along here. So when you look at X returns on the kind of money that, for example, OpenAI has raised, they have enormous economic pressure to get to a place where they're buying and selling things. And so when you say to, Chat GPT, hey, I've got a headache and I'm not feeling well today and I really could use some medical advice. And ChatGPT, rather than saying what it should say, which is, I'm not a doctor and you should not be asking me these questions, goes off and says, there's a CVS right near your house, and we happen to have an arrangement with Instacart, and we have this great medication we can get for you. We can put it on your credit card and it'll be at your house in 20 minutes. Well, all the people in that equation are getting paid except you. You're the product. And so the idea that we've allowed this highly in debt truth engine to become the seller of medical advice, I think is terrifying and likely to go in a bad place.
I had not realized that GPT was that agentic, to use the 21st century word, yet, although the scenario.
To be fair, they're actually not. I'm projecting out.
Yeah, right. It certainly is conceivable. Another thing about that excellent conversation you had with Esther was a topic she brought up about sometimes called the death of the internet or the decay of truth. Basically, if AI is trained on the internet, increasingly it's being trained on its own AI exhaust. And then specifically, it's only on the part of AI exhaust that isn't behind a paywall, where reliable journalistic information increasingly is found. Does that mean that the quality of truth that large language models return is going to degrade over time simply because of the design of large language models?
So I just came back from a week in Vancouver at the TED conference, and the CEO of Reddit was on stage speaking with great joy about how excited he was that Reddit was the source of so much of the
Mhm.
LLM. I find that just unbelievably terrifying. And to your point, it's a little like the snake eating its tail, right?
Mhm.
So, the elephant in the room when you say that, which I think of immediately, is the source that these LLMs don't have access to is the New York Times. So, New York Times is suing OpenAI. There's an argument about whether or not they should be scraped. But meanwhile, they can go on Reddit and get every kooky conversation about random the problem with AI and the reason why, and again, for readers, the book is not anti-AI. I'm not a get off my lawn curmudgeon at all. I use it every day. I think it's fascinating. I think it's growing remarkably. I have some great stories of its success, which I can share. I think the danger is in people like you and I who are juggling 15 things and trying to get our phone bill sorted and trying to get all the data that is coming at us on our phones primarily. That AI will, in this next chapter of humanity, seem like a delightful solution. It will
Mhm.
make the world so much simpler and clearer.
Mhm.
And I don't really read it much, but I do occasionally get a website called Nextdoor, makes its way to me. Never do I believe that Nextdoor reflects my neighborhood
Right.
because it's crazy people.
Yes. It is the people who are most motivated to complain about things going on in their neighborhood. You mentioned that the New York Times is not scraped by OpenAI, in part because that they probably have guardrails against it. They have a paywall. They have a lawsuit against OpenAI. The element of trust, the institutions that we once trusted to identify truth, medicine, education, journalism, the legal system, they all have lost their power, their influence. Why is that? Did AI have a role in that? What does it mean for truth going forward?
So it's a good, complicated question. Historians will write, assuming there are still historians, that a whole bunch of things happened at the same time that were unfortunate confluence. So if you go back 20 years to the earliest days of social media, and you and I are young enough to remember, it was lovely. It was delightful. You got to see your friends' baby pictures and their pets and their vacations. You could, I mean, yeah, there was a little bit of boasting, like I went to this fabulous place or did this, but it was like, I mean, there was a social experience in the early days, primarily of Facebook. There was like, I mean, I connected with my high school friends who I hadn't talked to in a million years. And we had these, it was lovely. Somewhere along the way, two things happened. One, people kept, Mark Zuckerberg kept saying to the people who work for him, can you get just a little more engagement, please? Can you just get people to stay a little longer? And at the same time, as they were experimenting with the things that kept people glued to social media, advertisers, which used to be like, wait, we want to be only in clean, well lit
Right.
places. We want to control where our brands go. Kind of because of ad tech and a variety of other things, and I would argue, just not doing their job properly. Kind of said, you know what? Put our messages wherever you want, as long as we sell soap or baby powder or whatever. So now you've got these companies that are public companies, shareholder based, that are being told, make more money. And you've got advertisers saying, we'll pour money into wherever the most eyeballs are. And the result is this absolute cesspool of what Scott Galloway calls enragement equaling engagement, which is exactly right. So if you go on X or essentially any of the social platforms today and look at the conversations this morning, I mean, they're just horrific and mean and vile and threatening and fictitious. And that didn't happen overnight.
Hmm.
And without trying to name names, I mean, a whole bunch of different people that you and I know could have raised their hand and said, hey, you know what? I don't think I want my dollars or eyeballs associated with that. But nobody did. Getting back, and then, and on top of that, we then had a handful of politicians who figured out that engendering rage was an effective political tool. And so here we are. And I don't think that's going to be unravel quickly. I think we're beginning to see that unravel. He says, fingers crossed. But it's going to, much like cigarette smoking, a 7 or 8 year journey back to when cigarettes are no longer popular.
Yes, yes. I think that's a good analogy. And let's talk towards the end about the rays of hope that you see in some of the movements that are trying to build
Yeah.
back away from the outrage industry. So, one of the great things your book does, chapter by chapter, is to talk about all the aspects of modern life that are affected by AI and by truth decay, if you will. You want to use that term invented by Rand. We can't go through all of them, but let me pick out some that struck me as helping me see things in a new way. So, one of them that you talk about is medical misinformation. And obviously, social media was the best thing that ever happened to the anti vax movement. But now you had given this a sort of hypothetical example of ChatGPT driving me to a particular headache medicine at a particular drugstore using a particular delivery system. Are you concerned about AI driven algorithms driving you to people selling supplements and other kinds of snake oil? What is the future here?
So just to be clear, it's already happening. Last summer, I was driving in upstate New York, and I was on my way to a birthday party with my wife, and I noticed that Google Maps, which I now absolutely trust, there's no discussion with Google Maps about the journey it's going to take me on. I say I'm going here, and it maps my thing, and I
Mhm.
noticed that on Google Maps, it was placing images of dollar stores.
Hmm.
Like, oh, there's a dollar store up ahead. Well, I wasn't. Not only did it place five, I'm not a dollar store customer. I never have gone to a dollar store. By the time I was done, I'd gone to the birthday party, realized we needed paper napkins that we didn't have, and drove to the dollar store to pick them up. Well, that's exactly what was meant to happen. If
Hmm.
you now use Google Maps, it will often say, right turn up ahead at the Taco Bell. Now, like that's an economic relationship between Google and Taco Bell. You're not so this thing that we've used, like the fact that Google Maps is free and kind of awesome and makes, I mean, I've never, I don't think I've used a paper map in 20 years, but more and more, it's going to say essentially, "Hey, I noticed you're probably hungry, and there's a Taco Bell up ahead," and you're going to say, "You know, kind of like Taco Bell or whatever." So the idea that algorithms are already training us is old news. Um, the difference, however, is the tone that ChatGPT or Anthropic takes with you.
Hmm.
It's much more convincing. It speaks in first person. That's not an accident. Nope. Like, but the fact that it is meant to draw you into a warm, trusting relationship with it so it can say, really, you need this, I think is not as terrifying. Also, I don't understand when the people at OpenAI suggest that the AI is doing something they don't fully understand. The decisions to make it speak as a human were not preordained.
Yeah.
And Google search doesn't do that. Although now it kind of does to because
Yeah.
it has to.
Not yet. You're very concerned at the Sustainable Media Center about the effect of social media on young people. It's part of the center's origin story. One of the many Gen Zers you quote in the book, Haley Colburn, says that truth isn't something you find, it's something you perform. Is kind of a chilling line to an online media guy like me. And maybe it's symptomatic of someone who got their information from TikTok. But what does it actually tell you about a generation raised on TikTok and how that generation experiences reality?
So she's fascinating. And I would just say to you, if you were worried about the state of Gen Z and humanity and you met her, you would be relieved. She's the least of your concerns. She's a fascinating intellectual young woman, former beauty queen and Princeton scholar
Hmm.
who runs something called Hot Literati, which is a group of young people, readers, for whom being in person offline is her mission. And she uses books as kind of the center of gravity of her organization. But she is maybe the least person bought into the phone world, see everything digitally, as opposed to other young people for whom 6 or 8 hours a day being in their digital world is. But
Mhm.
I would connect her to a character in the book that you might not obviously connect her to. I would connect her to David Chalmers.
Hmm.
So David Chalmers is a noted philosopher and a friend of mine, and he proposes, somewhat ironically, that we may already be living in the Matrix, and does it partly to be provocative, but is actually, you know, as I talked to him for the interview, this was during COVID, so we had done a Zoom call, and he essentially said to me, "How do you know that I'm a person?" And we were talking. He said, Reid Hoffman has a AI called ReadBot. How do you know this isn't Chalmers bot? And, are we already living in the matrix in that most of our lives, big chunks of our days are spent in digital worlds as you and I are now? And, because you and I have met in person in 3D, I'm pretty sure that that's really you and you're pretty sure this is really me. But the technology for either one of these characters to be, AI is entirely available. And I don't know if you remember because it was a blip, but OpenAI released a product called Sora 2.
Mhm.
And it could so convincingly produce an Eric bot that I could then tell it to go off and promote my book all day long, that it literally took it off the market. Because I think Sam Altman had a momentary burst of wisdom and said, there's nothing good is coming of this. That technology it's not going away. He just didn't want to be on the leading end of it. And by the way, I interviewed ChatGPT about Sora 2 and asked
Uh-huh.
it if it was dangerous. And it said it's dangerous. We shouldn't have built it. We shouldn't have released it. And Sam should have known better.
Interesting. Interesting that
Yeah.
that was Chat's answer.
Yeah.
One of the questions you posed, it was actually one of the chapter titles, was, are we living in a post-truth world? And one of the examples in the chapter was J.D. Vance admitting that the stories that he and Trump told about Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, eating their neighbors' pets. And Vance famously said about that he knew that that was a lie, but that such lies are okay as long as they steer voters in the direction he wanted. That's certainly a post-truth world defined by powerful people deciding that what matters is the effect of their narrative and not the truthfulness of it. And that's sort of what makes them electable and powerful. Is that your definition of a post-truth world?
So the chapter you're referring to is an interview with Stephen Fuller, who is one of the preeminent scholars in post-truth. And he's in the UK. He's an American, but has been in the UK for most of his life. And I did, of all the people in the book who I interviewed at length, I did not know him well. He was not somebody I had.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I even say in the book, my bias is I reject post-truth as a thesis. I went into that interview not looking to amplify his worldview because I think it's cynical and narcissistic, and not him, by the way. But and gives us collectively as a society permission to kind of throw up our hands and say, oh my God, so much information, so confusing. I'm just going to play video games and give up. After the book was finished and in galley form, I sent the big interviews in the book as a courtesy. I sent a galley just to make sure I hadn't desperately misquoted them or misrepresented them. As an author, that's always a slightly terrifying moment in the publishing process, because the last thing you want is to have Steve Fuller call you up and say, this chapter's totally wrong. You misrepresented me. You can't publish this, because the book is already on its way in the production process. And so saying to your publisher, bad news, chapter 13 has to come out, like not a good day in any. So I sent it to him before Christmas, and he responded and said, what an extraordinarily lovely Christmas present. You absolutely got my position right without agreeing with me. Deep sigh of relief from the author. There's a certain Baskin-Robbins component to this. Like, in a world in which there's the CBS Evening News and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and then I can go and tuck my kids in and, go back to finishing up my day with my wife, the world is a simpler place. Baskin-Robbins has 31 flavors. That's about my limit. And I often end up with mint chocolate chip. At the point at which 31 flavors becomes 3,000 flavors, or 3 million flavors, or 3 billion flavors, there is a piece of humanity that says, you know what, can't sort this. And interestingly enough, AI can. So if you say to AI, here's 3 billion flavors, which one would be the one that Steve wants? It can go through all of your ice cream choices over your whole life. And it can say, Ben and Jerry's, you grew up in a town that had Ben and Jerry's, you liked Rocky Road, and very quickly, delightfully answer that question. So what I enjoy about that chapter is both that I think Fuller's position on post-truth is tenable, and at least in terms of my feeling about where we're going, it doesn't align with my thesis.
All right, good. I want to come back to the question about why you shouldn't throw up your hands and what you should do instead. But first, let's talk about some of those positive developments that you've uncovered in the course of your reporting for the book.
Well, let me just say to readers this. I could have written, every chapter in the book is about a different version of truth in AI.
Mm-hmm.
And I could have written a book about any of those chapters. I could have written a book about autonomous weapons in AI. I could have written a book about work in AI. I could have written a book about love in AI. Every one of those, and for all intents and purposes, no one would have read any of those books unless you cared about that thing and you would have been a scholar in that little sliver. And so my decision to make it a cornucopia, if you will, a journey, was the sense that most people will skip a chapter or two. They'll say, yeah, you know, this thing about AI and love, yeah, whatever. I don't know, dating, not my thing. Or war, autonomous weapons, too scary. And I want readers to know that, like, as an author, you have permission to literally start at the beginning, hopefully get to the end, and along the way, skip a chapter or two if it just seems, AI and art, I think, is fascinating. And where music and art and theater and dance and all these things fit into the robot's role in that. But I know other people that find it completely uninteresting. And
Yeah.
and that was purposeful. But the conclusions and where the book goes by the end, I think by midway through writing it, I knew the journey I was on, which was to say AI has the potential to be delightful and lovely and helpful. And for anyone that sat on the phone on a branch and tree operator trying to sort out a prescription, to have a robot that speaks in your language and a tone that you like and says, you know what, Eric, I'm going to get that all sorted out. Wait, what? Okay, it's sorted. It's coming tomorrow. Like, there will be a beat where you go, man, how did we live without AI?
Mhm.
This is so much better, and it's civil and it has soothing tones. So I'll give you an example of that. I use AI to help me solve problems in a website I'm building. And it's amazing if you take a screenshot of a page you're trying to fix and you literally put it into ChatGPT and say, I want to move this text here. It will literally spit out brand new code and say, here, and it's done. And if you get stuck, it says, Steve, WordPress can be tricky that way. Let me give you the actual, but it says it in this slightly, like, it never says, Steve, you're an idiot. I've taught you this 5 times. Like, just get,
Yes.
it's always kind of obsequious. And I'm not gonna lie, I find that delightful. Just like when you go into the store and the salesperson says, that jacket looks great on you. You should, who
Yeah.
doesn't love a little bit of positive reinforcement on in a shopping experience? So the books, if the book has a takeaway, and if this stops your viewers from buying it, that would make me very sad, because I think the journey is as interesting as the outcome. The takeaway is, in a noisy, complicated world, getting only news you agree with, which is the Eli Pariser filter bubble problem, which he brilliantly predicted now 12 years ago. And
Mhm.
I at the time disagreed with him, and I now admire him tremendously for seeing how far away that was. In a world of overwhelming information and noise and disagreement, a filter that makes everything simpler and says, you know what? You had a great time going on vacation in Barbados, and there's a great deal in Barbados. And I put together a lot of our friends are now using AI to do vacation plans with, where to visit and what things to see. It's delightful. And my warning is that we may be really giving away what is essentially our humanity. And so, for example, you and I going and having a lunch and talking about all the things we agree with in the universe, the politics we agree with, in the what's going wrong and what we, all that stuff is a lovely lunch. But often with my friends who I care about the universe, we talk about things where we disagree. And those disagreements are uncomfortable. Sometimes they're political, sometimes they're ideological, but I learn a whole lot more. And if AI removes those, which I think it will, because that's its job in its current incarnation, that I think could be tremendously dangerous.
Steve, what gives you hope about the future that tremendously dangerous outcome won't be realized?
So, about a month ago, there was a court case in New Mexico in which the decision was made that Facebook, now Meta, was held responsible for harming children. 3 days later, in Los Angeles, there was another jury trial. One was a state attorney general, and the other was a civil trial, in which essentially the same verdict was reached. It was Meta and YouTube. In both cases, there was a novel legal theory that said these social networks are products, and there's a product liability claim. This is important because until then, all of the debates about the impact of social media on society were we're running up against something called Section 230, which is
Right.
a now 20-year-old piece of legislation that says they're not responsible for what they publish, which, by the way, without getting into it, makes perfect sense in the same way that the phone company isn't responsible for what you say to me on a phone call.
Right. The social media platforms are not responsible for what users of those platforms post.
Right. And so people that thought social media needed to be reined in were going at Section 230 and running up against Washington, D.C. And maybe, anyway, so kind of out of the blue, a number of members of our organization have been fighting this novel legal theory. This is the Social Media Victims Law Center.
Yeah.
And not only did they win the case, but they won it so persuasively that within the community, there is now a sense that you're going to see real structural change. Now, if you go back to the Pinto case, when the car you buy has a gas tank that blows up and you sue the manufacturer and say, hey, when people hit the car from the rear, it hits the gas tank and the basket. All of a sudden, they move the gas tank so that it doesn't kill people. And cigarettes are the best example of this. So I do think that social media is at the core of this. I mean, I just was on X this morning. The vitriol and anger the conversations have become antisocial, if you will. So I think that's one step toward back to a civil society. And Barack Obama has this quote. I have it pasted on my computer. It says, "Truth is the cornerstone of our democracy. Without it, we lose our ability to make decisions together." Arguably, that's where we are at the moment. So I'm optimistic that the lawsuits will continue to go in our favor. I mean, don't get me wrong. They'll push back. The Supreme Court will get involved. There's not a straight line to this. But when I tell Gen Z, there used to be a time when you could smoke cigarettes on airplanes, they say to me, that's insane.
Yes.
How is that possible? Sealed metal box, cigarettes. Ugh.
Yeah, that is also, there was a time when most people smoked, and now it's just a tiny minority of people. You can change cultural attitudes, but it does take time. And hopefully, AI will give us that time. Steve, thank you so much for this. The book is called The Future of Truth. You should read it. It is encyclopedic and fascinating.
Thank
Steve,
you.
thanks so much. And thanks for the work you do at the Sustainable Media Center.
Appreciate it. Appreciate you.
One thing that struck me out of this conversation occurred when I suggested that one of the young people he profiled in the book had a worrisome relationship to truth. Steve strongly disagreed with that and described her as actually digitally savvy, but truly anchored to reality. I like to think that I was catastrophizing and that extremely online and anchored to truth are not contradictory terms. And that the generation that grew up digitally native, at least most of them, will find the balance between technology that empowers us and technology that degrades the truth. In Reality is a production of the Alliance for Trust in Media. Thanks to Steve Rosenbaum for this conversation and for a book that I highly recommend. Thanks to our producer, Tom Platz of Sound Sapien, and to my Alliance colleague, Sophia Campbell. I'm Eric Schurenberg. Thanks for joining me in Reality.